Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm here with Ben Horowitz, co-founder and general partner of Andreessen Horowitz. Before that, founder and CEO of Opsware, somebody who doesn't need much of an introduction. But he's also a two-time best-selling author. His most recent book is What You Do Is Who You Are, How to Create Your Business Culture. We're going to spend a couple of minutes talking with Ben about this book and about company culture. So Ben, I know you've talked about this before, but I think for the viewers, a good question up front is, why write this book in particular? What is it about company culture, organization culture that interests you, that made you want to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, well, it was the thing that I struggled with most when I was CEO. When I became CEO the first time, I asked all the kind of veteran CEOs, what should I focus on to be a great CEO? You know, what should I do? And they pretty consistently said, Ben, pay attention to the culture. And I was, great. How do I do that? And that's kind of where the advice stopped. And most of the things written on it have been relatively trivial, based on one organizational behavior kind of experiment or something like that. And so, but when you look at it, it turns out to be a really important thing. So if you go, well, how does your company behave? Particularly how does it behave when you're not looking? Do they show up to meeting on time? If somebody calls them, do they return the call? If it's a person who's a lower rank than them, do they return it? Do they return it that day? Do they return it the next day? Do they return it the next week? All these things. If they do a deal, is it for the price or for the partnership? What are they optimizing? And so all those things, which are not in your goals and objectives, they're not in your mission statement, they're not in your OKRs, they're how you behave on a daily basis, how people experience your company, what you're like to do business with, what you're like to work at. All that stuff is your culture. But the amount of attention it's paid to in the management literature is like close to zero or close to zero usefully. So I thought it was an important thing to try and get at, well, how do you move that? How do you shape it? How do you change it? Because you can't just do the simple thing. You can't say, oh, well, we'll put in your performance review, did you follow the cultural values? Well, you don't know if they received that phone call, so you definitely don't know if they returned it. So that's not going to be the thing that drives the culture. What's going to drive the culture are all these little behaviors, all these little cues that people take about, this is what I have to do to succeed in this company.
Yeah, you make the point that I think a lot of people would confuse a company's values with their culture, and you're saying that culture is different than values. How so?
Yes, and I go to the Bushido, which is the way of the warrior, kind of the code of the samurai. And what the samurai said was, a culture is not a set of beliefs, it's a set of actions, which is hence the name of the book. Mm-hmm. What you do is who you are. It's not what you tweet, it's not what you believe, it's not the values on the wall, it's what you do. That's who you are. And that's why we don't call them values, or they didn't call them values. They call them virtues, because it's only a thing if you manifest it. If you believe it, it's nothing. If you put it on the wall, it's nothing. If you actually do it and everybody does it and you have cultural cohesion, then it's a virtue.
Makes sense. I'm going to come back to the Bushido later. I think it's been said that, in tech startups and startups in general, first-time founders focus on product. Second-time founders focus on distribution, sales, and marketing. When you were CEO and you're reaching out,
you kind of have to focus on both, brother.
Sure, yes, yeah. But where the focus ends up being if you're new to it. How many times do you have to be a founder before you realize that culture is that important? Did you take the advice of the CEOs that you talked to as seriously as you probably should, or did it take a while to learn that lesson?
Well, I think it always seems important, but then what do you do about it? Right. So, look, and nobody has a perfect culture. Everybody's got violations. There's nobody who's got 100%, adherence to the culture. But what do you do when it's off? Or how do you design it? Or what's important in the culture? Or how many things can you have? All that. I didn't know any of that. And, that's really what the book is about, and what I try and explain is, okay, when you're off culture, how do you move it to a better place?
Yeah.
And it's going to happen. It happens. It's amazing. Even the companies with the very best cultures drift often, but the really great leaders can help move it back to the place where it should be.
So that leads to my next question. And looking for examples of people who did that, one of my favorite aspects of the book and how you created it is you found examples that were way outside of traditional tech or leadership examples, that you mentioned the Bushido code, Genghis Khan, Shaka Senghor. I just have to ask, how on earth did you find all these examples?
Well, it's funny, I've been a student of leadership and culture for many years, and I ended up reading a lot of things on it, everything from, the Art of War, the Hagukari, I've read a lot about the Haitian Revolution and so forth, just, various leaders in history. And I always found that, those four to be the ones that kind of taught me the most. And it's, there's things that you can figure out on your own if you're a CEO and like, okay, that worked or this worked or I behave this way and it moves things that way. But I wanted to look to the people who did things where I would never have thought of those things and they were super effective for them. So that's kind of where they came from. They just happen to be the people who most influenced me, and they are. It's funny. I get asked that a lot. It's in a way a weird set of examples. In my mind, it's an obvious set of examples.
Interesting. When being a student of leadership, is that mostly to be a better leader yourself in Opsware at Andreessen Horowitz, or for you to evaluate leaders as an investor, or both?
Well, it's just been it's something that I've been interested in. Culture is a very powerful thing, but very few people understand how it works or why it's so powerful. It turns out to be a much stronger force than a lot of the things that people end up focusing on, either in a company or in society. And so, explaining and understanding how that worked has always just been a deep interest of mine. And it's funny, when I met Shaka, he was 19 years in prison. 7 years in solitary confinement and all that kind of thing, and led a prison gang and so forth. And most people read his book, and it was a story, for them of redemption, how this guy who went to prison for murder came out and, became a best-selling author and, kind of an activist for anti-recidivism and so forth. But, for me, it was a story of leadership and somebody who really understood culture and how to develop it, control it, change it, and so forth.
Yeah, he's my favorite part of the book. It's probably the most striking example of a culture that you wouldn't know much about.
Unless you were in prison. Yeah.
Sure. I love the story of how you met him as well, how your wife inviting him to dinner. I had a specific question about Shaka. You already talked about why he's a good example. You could add more to that. But the use of diagnostics that he talks about, one gang does something to one of your members, how you respond to that really is a diagnostic for them to figure out.
Yeah.
Understanding culture, truly understanding, is difficult. How much of a role do diagnostics play in that in your mind?
Well, there's always, I think it's very important, because there's always, what is on the surface and then what's underneath in the actual kind of motivation. And I think that, when you look at, that Shaka story where basically he says, okay, Ben, imagine somebody in a rival gang steals one of your members' toothbrush. What do you do? How do you react to that? And if you take it on the surface, it's like, okay, maybe they're interested in dental hygiene and great, let them brush their teeth. I don't care about a toothbrush. But of course, that was a diagnostic to say, okay, are you weak? Can I rob you? Can I murder you? Can I do something much more severe? And so how you react is going to, the one thing it does is you have to do something to protect your group. But on the other hand, if you have too harsh a response, then you've set a very kind of violent tone, a violent culture for yourself. And I think that, that kind of idea happens in business a lot, where somebody will do something, and this is, one of the most important things about managing the culture is somebody will do something, and if you're looking at it through an individual lens, and you say, okay, yeah, that person, he kind of took some credit for her work, but like it wasn't that clear, and he's really good and does good work himself, so maybe I ought to let that go, because if I confront him on it, like maybe I'll quit and go to Facebook or whatever, and then I'll lose a really good employee. But if you look at that same incident through a cultural lens, that's a little bit of a test for everybody to say, oh, you can just take credit for somebody's work and get yourself a promotion or a pat on the back or a this or that.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody's going to go play that game if you let that go. So, part of being good at managing culture is being able to recognize what it is. And so that's, a lot of what Shock ended up doing in prison, which is, it's leadership compared to leadership, not prison compared to business.
Yeah.
But a lot of what he did is easier to see. It's easier to see in somebody else's culture how the mechanics work than in your own, where you think of it as just, oh, that's how we do things around here.
Yeah. So in looking at those things, diagnostics,
Mm-hmm.
there's small things and there are big things. I think one of the examples that you had in the book was a head of marketing at one of your companies was great at storytelling, which is helpful in marketing, but also it turns out he was lying.
He's also good at lying.
Yeah. So that's obviously a big one.
Different kind of storytelling.
The one you just mentioned, maybe taking somebody's credit for somebody's work is not as big a one. How do you decide, or how do you think about looking at major examples of culture, the major actions that everybody's going to pay attention to, versus the small ones which may have outsized impact?
Well, look, I think that a lot of it comes back to, okay, who you are. So on the one hand, if you look at, well, who's Amazon? Amazon wanted to be, they came out wanting to be, we're going to be the low price leader. You're never going to have to comparison shop because it's always going to be cheapest at Amazon. So part of the culture necessarily was, we're not going to waste money. And they did all kinds of things to set that. And so if you see somebody wasting money at Amazon, that's a big deal. Apple doesn't have that culture, doesn't have that product positioning. They're building the premium product. They're building the most beautifully designed product. And so, look, they spend a lot of money. And if you waste money at Apple, well, that's probably not as big a cultural violation because it's not fundamental to what they want to be and the strategy of the business. So you really have to start with, okay, who are we? Who do we want to be? And then if there's something that takes you off of that, even if it's little, it's important. Here, one of the things we want to be very respectful and empathetic to the entrepreneurial journey. So here, in a normal place, if you're late for a meeting, it's probably not that big a deal. Here, if you're late, it's a very bad problem if it's with an entrepreneur, because we do not want to be under any circumstances disrespectful in that regard, because that's off culture for us, not for everybody.
And you have actually even created what I think in the book you would call a shocking rule to demonstrate that if you're late for a meeting here with an entrepreneur, you have to pay, what is it, $10 a minute?
Yeah, $10 a minute fine. Yeah. It's funny because it's a little bit borrowed from Tom Coughlin, who used to coach the New York Giants, and he had this saying, if you're on time, you're late. He would fine you for being on time. Here, that doesn't quite work, because it's a pretty neat idea for a football team. I need to make a little adjustment to make it work in venture capital.
And I think if I remember correctly from the book, it was a $1,000 fine if you were late for Tom Coughlin.
Yeah, and people were furious. They complained to the New York Times, so forth, but it ended up setting the culture that won them 2 Super Bowls. So
yeah. Let's come back to the Bushido, and the samurai, the code of the warrior. One of the things that I thought was noteworthy in how you described it was just its longevity. Hundreds and hundreds of years. What do you maybe talk a little bit about the Bushido code for the viewers, but maybe talk also about why you think it lasted so long.
There's a lot that went into it lasting for so many years. Part of it was the fact that the code itself sat above the hierarchy. So you had the samurai, and you had lords, and you had all these kinds of things. But the code was above, when it came to the behavior of the samurai, the code was above everything. And because the code outlasts any person, a CEO goes, maybe the culture changes. Toussaint got captured by Napoleon. That changed the culture of Haiti. But, the samurai, the code was always above everything. And then that code was super meticulously constructed. So it wasn't just the elaboration of all the points, it was how it was balanced. So, for example, they were an honor culture. Which many were honor cultures, but the reason for this is Similar to in Shaka's situation, if you're threatened in the samurai, there's no uniformed police or anything. It's just you. You're the samurai. So if somebody insults you, that could be a diagnostic that they're going to stab you in the head or cut your head off or whatever. So insults were not tolerated in honor culture. It got to the point where there's famous samurai story where a flea jumped on the back of a samurai, and another guy said, "Hey, there's a flea on your back," and the samurai cut his head off. And he said, "Well, that's really harsh." And he said, "Why'd you cut his head off? He just told you there was a flea on your back." He said, "I'm not an animal. I don't have fleas." So he just took it as an insult.
Yeah.
And so you can't just have that, people cutting people's heads off for such, small slights. So they had another part of the culture that's super elaborate around politeness. And politeness was really the best way to show love and appreciation for somebody else by following strictly the rules of politeness, be it how you bow or how you do serve tea or any kind of thing. Very, very intricate. They train the kids on it. And even now, if you go to Japan, it's amazing how much more polite everybody is. And how much more respected you feel.
Mm-hmm.
So it really does work. But then they had to, design it so that didn't go too far. So they had this part of the politeness code, which is without veracity, politeness is an empty gesture. So it not only did you have to show respect, you had to mean it.
Yeah.
And so that, those kinds of elements really made it last a long time. They also had great stories and other elements to it, but it's a very, very well-designed code. A lot of people disagree with some of the virtues that they had.
Yeah.
I don't think we should live in an honor culture today in that same way.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't the point of the book. The point of the book was what works in getting to cultural cohesion.
They had the system was comprised of 8 virtues. Is that correct? Eight
Mm-hmm.
virtues. I think
eight core virtues.
8 core virtues.
Yeah.
I think one of the things
Arguably 14, depending how you count them.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought you made really clear in the book are the examples of you have 8 or 14 virtues that
Mm-hmm.
may conflict with each other. One of the ways that they helped resolve those conflicts is be very specific with examples of what you should do and how some of those virtues are offsetting, as you mentioned.
Right, exactly.
So that kind of leads into my next question about cultures that go awry. One of the cultures that you talked about in the book where they had a lot of different values, whether they lived up to them or whether they were just words, was separate from the fact that it seemed like one value was above all else, competitiveness. And a company that valued competitiveness over anything would do anything that it took to win. And so I wonder if you talk about, how do companies who have multiple different values that may compete with each other, how do you make sure that one doesn't accidentally override the others?
Yeah, and I think that, the big, and the place where Uber went astray, and I think the mistake that's most often made on this is basically the ethical line. So we need to make why do you violate ethics? Well, I need to make the quarter. We need to win this deal. We need to beat this competitor. We need to hire this candidate. We need to, there's some business imperative that's driving you, something in your mission and your goals, in your ethos that will, if not, if you don't make very explicit what the ethics are, then you're going to cross that line.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened at Uber, where, they were so good at being competitive that, where that line was got very fuzzy, and they had quite a few violations. Probably the great counterexample to this, which I use in the book, was Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. And he did, maybe the most important thing he did, the most important rule he put in place in winning the only successful slave revolt in human history, was this idea that his slave army went pillage. And you go, well, okay, they don't pillage. That doesn't seem like that big a deal. Well, this is a war over sugar. And you have all the European superpowers, the Spanish, the British, the French, fighting for control of the sugar. They're all basically paying their mercenary military forces through pillaging and the perks, the spoils of war, so to speak. But Toussaint and gained this tremendous advantage by being very, very explicit about not pillaging. He outlawed pillaging, and he said, look, we're fighting for liberty. They're fighting for sugar. We're fighting for liberty. You can't achieve liberty by taking people's liberty, so we're not going to do it. And the stories of the time are just incredible, where you see the reports of the Spanish army moving in, setting the plantations on fire, killing all the animals, stealing all the stuff. And then this slave army moves through. They're half naked, they're starving, and they literally touch nothing and go right through. And it was through that that culture of liberty that they actually gained the support, these African slaves, of the white Europeans on the colony, where they supported Toussaint's forces over the European armies, which, quite remarkable. But it was the thing that really created cohesion around the loyalty of the army, which was amazing. The discipline of the army all came out of this idea that we're fighting for a higher purpose.
Yeah.
And so, yes, winning the war is important, just like being competitive is important for a business, but not as important as what we're fighting for. And that ends up being a really, I think, important cultural lesson.
Yeah, I think you make the point in that regard that the why, when you're talking about ethics, is important. And it sounds like Toussaint did a great job explaining the why. We're fighting for freedom. We're not trying to win the war. We're trying to win our freedom.
Exactly.
At Okta, one of our core values is integrity. And when we talk about it, you don't talk about why do you have a value called integrity for obvious reasons. I mean, who would argue with that?
Right.
But we say, what we're trying to do is a decades-long vision. Our customers need to trust us for what we do for them, and integrity is an integral part of that. That's the why behind that one.
Yeah, well, and there's a great story of that, which is, and the samurai has a great saying on ethics, which is, in ordinary times, you can't even tell. But when something happens, all is revealed. And that actually happened at Okta. There was a deal. So, look, it makes sense for, integrity, honesty. Can you trust Okta is a big element of what the business is about, because, hey, if we've got all your credentials, that's a heck of a problem if you can't trust us, if we slip in any way against that promise of protecting your credentials. Yep. And so very early on in the business, when the business was not going as well as it is today, and we were running up against the B round of fundraising, which was the first round, after we invested. And look, the company was missing their quarters and so forth, and really needed to make the quarter. And there was a deal, I think it was with Sony, and the sales representative had promised a feature, not that we were never planning on building, but we weren't planning on building that fast. And we had to decide, okay, we're going to take that deal, make the quarter, and not tell them when the feature was really coming, or were we going to tell them? And it ended up being really important to the way everybody behaved for the rest of the time at Okta. What Todd did, which is he said, look, we're going to go ahead and miss the quarter. And, thankfully, we were able to raise money from Coastal Ventures. But it was right up against it because he said that. Now, if you kind of fast forward through Okta's history, one thing that has distinguished the company is, its unbelievable lack of downtime. I think we went over 4 years without ever going down, not even for maintenance. I think never had any kind of serious breach.
Yep.
Whereas the competitor, the startup competitor, I won't name them, had a giant breach, which kind of ended our competition with them. But all of that kind of originated with this basic belief that if we couldn't be trusted, we shouldn't even be in the game.
Yep.
And that was more important than making a quarter, and more important than competing, and more important than raising the round. Was number one is we had to be trustworthy.
Yeah. To add to that story, it wasn't just a deal that would have made the quarter for us. It would have been the biggest deal in the company's history. Yep. And talk about, culture is what you do.
And everybody noticed it, right?
Everybody
because it was a big deal.
Yep.
That's the other thing, right? Everybody was paying attention. What is Todd going to do?
Yep.
And so that's why it became extra important what he did.
And that is part of our lore. We talk about that example all the time. When in the new hire orientation, we talk about our culture values. That story comes up all the time. So
it's an awesome story.
Yeah. As we get close to wrapping up here, I want to talk about something we mentioned before with Toussaint and the value of making shocking rules. And you talked a little bit about it. How often can you use that? The example at A16Z is a shocking rule is if a partner is late to a founder, they have to pay money, and everybody knows that. That's part of your guys' story. But how often can you use that, or how selective?
Or how many shocking rules?
Yeah, before they start to lose their value.
I think that one, they're hard to design, so you shouldn't underestimate that. So just like pick an idea of something you want in the culture, and then try and figure out a shocking rule. Like that, it's not always that easy.
Yeah.
And sometimes they bite you back. I mean, Facebook had a great one, move fast and break things, which, people criticize it now, but nobody was saying that when they ran past MySpace, when MySpace had an invincible network effect and monopoly position.
Yep.
Facebook out-featured them probably 10-1. That was move fast and break things was one of the things that gave people permission to go fast and not worry about the consequences because they had to kind of overtake MySpace. That was what they were trying to do. Now, later on, it didn't suit their needs and they had to change it. But that just, I think, is indicative of, it's complex to write these kind of rules, and then it's even more complicated to write one that is going to endure for a very long period of time. I think typically organizations might have one or two things that's shocking. Amazon had a couple. One of the things they had was early on when you went to work there, your desk was actually a door, held up by 2x4s. So it's like, we're not spending any money. That's like, that's pretty shocking to go into work and see that. One thing that they do that's also shocking, I think if you weren't ready for it, is, there's no PowerPoint in meetings. You've got to write this memo and so forth. So and it's just one of those things that goes like, why are we doing it that way? And then when you understand why, then you learn what the culture is about. And I think you want to kind of focus that on, that particular technique. You're probably not going to have more than a couple.
Yeah.
But it's powerful when you have one.
The Netflix example of Reed Hastings switching from DVDs to streaming. It kicked all the DVD execs out of the staff meeting, even though they were 100% of the revenue. Pretty shocking rule.
Yeah, that was, and he really just needed to reset the culture around what that company was going to be.
Yeah.
And that's a very hard thing to do, because if all your revenue is coming from here and the future is the businesses on the other side, you can't just tell people, streaming is important.
Yeah.
You got to show them. You got to. There's got to be a real object lesson there.
You mentioned with the Bushido Code, one of the reasons it was so long lasting is that it was above everything else. It was more important than any one person. Can you think of any companies where they have created a culture that has outlasted not just the founders maybe, but the executives? I mean, I guess Apple probably springs to mind.
So the one that really did for years in Silicon Valley was HP with the HP way. Now, they lost it eventually, but for many years, they were really meticulous with that and what it meant and how it worked, and the org structure supported it and so forth. And it was an amazing, it had a tremendously long-lasting impact on Silicon Valley. Intel would be the other one but they kind of passed it from Bob Noyce to Andy Grove.
Yep.
And later Craig Barrett. And, it's probably faded from it what it once was, but there are companies that do a good job. I think that the only way it works in a company is if the CEO that follows the original CEO is as bought into those cultural ideas, and that's why they do tend to change as opposed to having a code. Now, HP had a very strong code, and they drilled that code, as did Intel, and so I think that's why those lasted as long as they did.
Is that an argument for companies who are successful, who have great cultures, to promote successors from inside?
I think that generally tends to work better as a practice. I think there's been a lot in the literature about that. I think boards tend to not want to do it because they want to, go for a big name or this and that and the other. But I think that the history of it is that really successful successors do come from the inside. Now, there's a problem with that that's different, which I wrote a piece called Ones and Twos many years ago, where oftentimes the person who is the number two in the company isn't the right person to take over and run the company.
Yeah, I remember that piece. Well, I want to come back to a question that I asked at the beginning, but from a different angle, why you wrote this book. I think it's really admirable and what you're doing with the proceeds from the book, so I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so all the proceeds go to a combination of anti-recidivism and basically, donating money to Haiti and rebuilding it, and for different reasons. So, one, I was very appreciative to both Shaka Senghor and to Toussaint Louverture for providing the core inspiration for the book, and so it's just kind of a way of giving back to their causes. But particularly with anti-recidivism, we've gotten to a culture in our country where we have kind of come to broadly feel it's okay to throw people away. And what I mean by that, and this isn't just people who go to prison, but somebody says something on Twitter 10 years ago and they can never be forgiven, or somebody does something in their life 30 years ago and they can never be forgiven, and there's whatever, we're going to keep doing documentaries on it and we're going to ban them from talk on the Academy Awards or whatever. And I think that redemption ends up being a very important part of a culture because if you judge everybody by the worst thing that they ever did in their life, you just lose a tremendous amount of capability. And our prison system is one of the worst cases of that, where somebody might do something when they're 17 years old because they were following their idiot friend, and they land in prison, and then that's it, for them in our society. And so, I think getting past that is really, really important, and a lot of the work that's being done by organizations like the Anti-Recidivism Coalition and Cut 50 are helping with that a lot. So that's the reason behind the donation.
I love it. Well, I don't know if you know this, but I've been at Okta for a long time now, and the reason I found about Okta is from your writing. You wrote a blog post announcing your very first investment. I read your blog post. I was reading all of your stuff and got introduced to Okta in that way. So coming full circle, I really loved reading the book. A line that stuck with me, if I remember it correctly, is this book helps you do the things you need to do so you can be who you want to be. And it certainly made an impact on me. So I want to say thanks for writing the book, and thanks for taking the time with us here today.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you for building an awesome company.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben.
Okay, thank you.